A man covered in feathers fell out of the truck. The staff inside grabbed his neck and tried to catch him, but the man was so strong that he threw them out. To be precise, the man was not a human, but a bird covered in feathers. The father and son were frightened when they saw this. They hid in a corner, holding their breath and not daring to make any sound. Fortunately, the bird had no bad intentions. He shouted and leaped back. This is the recently released film. The setting of the doomsday disaster movie Animal Kingdom is in the near future. A mysterious virus has swept the world. All infected patients will have animal-like characteristics. Some people have feathers on their skin and can fly into the sky with their wings spread. Some people have become monsters that are neither human nor ghost. As time goes by, these infected patients will eventually lose consciousness and completely turn into animals. The government is helpless. They can only force detention of those infected who had already been converted. Then the scene at the beginning happened. Fortunately, the Birdman did not hurt the father and son. He just screamed and ran away. The staff behind him followed closely. Could it be that the wife of the infected person would end up like the Birdman? Mark believed that the government would develop an antidote to the virus. He took his son to the nursing home where his wife was held. The doctor informed Mark that monkey genes were found in his wife's body, indicating that without control of the disease, she would turn into a wild monkey. The doctor explained to Mark that the equipment here could not meet the treatment standards for the time being, and that his wife needed to be transferred to another city for treatment. Before leaving, Mark took his son to the hospital. The son came to the ward. The walls were covered with marks of being torn by claws. From the intact photo on the right, we can see that his wife still had some human consciousness at this moment. Mark came outside and wanted his son to go in and see his mother, but George seemed a little resistant. He couldn't face his mother's half-human, half-beast appearance. Then he kept picking at the transfer on the wall. The mother waited for a long time. The father and son's lack of reaction prompted her to turn around. His expression had slowly altered. Mark and George continued their migration journey after leaving the hospital. They had to accompany their children to distant cities, no matter where his wife was transferred to. After 2 days of driving, they stopped in a remote suburb. They rented this villa. With the introduction of a friend, Mark worked as a handyman in a nearby restaurant so that he could earn money and take care of his son. Mark thought that life would slowly get better, but suddenly he received a call from his wife's hospital. The other party said that his wife had a car accident during transportation, and the truck fell into the water. Realizing that something was wrong, the father and son drove to the scene and saw corpses floating on the water. Mark wanted to go forward to find his wife, but was stopped by the police. 3 strong men took great effort to subdue him. Mark sat on the ground in despair. He didn't know what to do next. Then a female police officer came over and claimed that Mark's wife was not on the list of victims. Unknown creatures attacked patients who then fled into the primitive forest, possibly including the father's wife. The father and son finally felt relieved. As long as his wife was not dead, there was still a glimmer of hope. Late at night, Mark hung the clothes that the two had worn in the yard outside. Monkeys have a sense of smell hundreds of times stronger than humans. This method may help find clothes. The wife waited until the next day when George went to a nearby school as an observer. When the students were playing tug of war, George was surprised to find that he could beat 4 peers at the same time. After the game, he felt something moving in his fingernail, so he rushed to the bathroom and used tweezers to pry it open. He discovered an undeveloped claw inside. George suspected that he might also be infected. He contracted the virus and noticed inexplicable spots on his back after removing his clothes and examining himself in the mirror. All these signs showed that he had begun to change. At the same time, Mark was buying a self-defense weapon in the supermarket. He wanted to go to the primitive forest alone to find his wife. At this time, a woman's shouting suddenly came from the side. Mark ran towards the sound, shouting his wife's name as he searched. Upon reaching the seafood section of the supermarket, he stopped. He shouted again, but an octopus-like monster came out. The monster thought Mark was coming to arrest him, so he threw out a lot of seafood and ran away quickly. While running, he also threw props behind him to block the female police officer's sight, but this did not help at all. The female police officer caught the octopus monster in the end. Mark, feeling useless, prepared to leave the supermarket. A tail under the shelf caught his attention. Mark squatted down and found a cute pangolin inside. He did not tell home and saw his son's hand wrapped in window stickers. He asked what happened. George lied and said that he accidentally fell down. The two then went to the primitive forest to look for their missing mother. They searched from morning till night but found nothing. At this time, the dog in the car seemed to be attracted by something and ran out. George followed and found a yellow sweater placed on the open space in the middle. The dog smelled the bread in the grass. As a result, the mutant inside was scared and climbed up the tree. The next second, a birdman rushed out from the corner and knocked George to the ground. He was the one who started work. The birdman leaped up and imprisoned George with his big legs, then used his sharp claws to stab his arm. The painful roar echoed through the ancient forest. Suddenly, the birdman sensed familiarity from George. He didn't recognize him. Not a human, but a mutant like him. He quickly retracted his claws and stood up. Mark also arrived at this time. He raised the stick to threaten the birdman to stay away from him, and then took George away from here to a nearby hospital. The doctor bandaged George's wound, but strangely, after George returned home, he tore off the tape on the wound and stretched out his tongue to lick the blood on it. His mutant characteristics are becoming increasingly obvious. He arrived at a nearby location. George rolled in the nearby fish pond. Afterwards, he picked up a carp and ate it in front of the neighbor lady. After replenishing his food, he came to the place where the Birdman attacked him yesterday. He found that the Birdman was determined to learn how to fly despite falling repeatedly. George took out 2 big carps from his bag and put them on the ground. Then he sat aside and watched the Birdman nibble quietly. The two became in order to help Birdman learn to fly as soon as possible. George took him to a nearby fish pond so that he would not get hurt due to mistakes. When Mark returned home at night, he found that the sink in the bathroom seemed to be blocked by something. He opened the water pipe and discovered it was the one George had removed earlier. Mark knew instantly that George was also infected with the mutant virus. He went outside and held out his claws. George ran away without looking back because he knew his father would definitely send him to the detention center for treatment. Seeing his son in pain, Mark finally softened his heart. He had already lost his wife, his only relative, and George could not lose him again. So Mark took on the role of taking care of George alone. But the good times did not last long. George met a classmate. The infected identity was accidentally exposed during the gathering. Everyone took out their dogs and went to the wilderness to capture George. At the critical moment, the Birdman flew out from the primitive forest. He covered George and led the hunters to another place. However, because the number of the opponent was too large, the Birdman eventually died at the gunpoint of the hunter. Mark knew that if his son was caught, the outcome would be the same. Luckily, heavy rain at that time halted the capture operation. George came to a mountain. He hid in the cave and was about to rest when a monkey came in from outside. It was George's mutated mother. He pressed his forehead against George and both of them shed tears. After pushing her son into the cave, the mother left because there were other hunters outside trying to catch George. So he had to lead them all away. This was the only thing a mother could do for her son. After leaving the cave, George ventured into the jungle, a world of mutants. It was inhabited by cows with dragon and tiger patterns, as well as a wild horse with thick, curly hair. They didn't look dangerous at all, but as a smoke bomb was thrown in from not far away, humans began to capture them. George was not spared and was caught. A chameleon crawled on the branches. George escaped a disaster. Since George did not completely turn into an animal, the police could not lock him up with the animals. The only way was to send him to a nearby nursing home. George did not want to go in, so he showed his fangs to the police. The police pulled out a pistol and wanted to shoot George to death. Fortunately, Mark was quick and pushed the other person to the ground. He took his son and escaped from the police station. George started, knowing that his father finally understood himself. Although he could not avoid the result of turning into an animal, to Mark he would always be his child. Upon reaching a primitive forest, he opened the passenger side door and released George. The outside world was now his, until his son vanished completely into the primitive forest. Mark smiled happily. Tears shed from the corners of my eyes.